Welcome to Productly Speaking, the podcast with real stories from real product people about the messy, surprising, and occasionally brilliant work of building things. I'm your host, Carl Abbott. Here we have no perfect processes, no polished answers, just honest conversations and lessons learned the hard way. Let's give this a go. Today's guest is no stranger to uncertainty and rapid change. Rick Lewis was previously Vice President of Commercial Products at Element, where he led product strategy and delivery for a global-scale SaaS platform. Today, he's helping Element Materials Technology craft AI solutions that deliver real value for customers. Rick has a unique ability to project confidence while navigating ambiguity, a skill that sets him apart and one every product leader needs to master. I'm pleased to welcome to Productly Speaking, Rick Lewis.
Thanks, Carl. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. So, Rick, you've worked through a lot of change in your career. What's the first thing you do when uncertainty hits?
I think that it's good to kind of take a broad view of it as possible, kind of get some perspective. So it's often a bit of a shock to people when change happens or it's on the horizon. And often, once you've kind of taken a broad view of it, looked at what it actually means, what's within your realm of control, that it becomes much easier to see what the steps forward are.
Yeah, so understanding what you can control and what you can't control, which...
Yeah, absolutely. I think that people are often fearful that change is inherently a bad thing, but it's not. It's just a natural fact of life and something that we have to cope with. So it's taking a dispassionate view of what is the actual situation, what are the things that we can control versus those that we can't, and then how do we start to work out the best path forward through that change and through whatever challenges are in front of us.
Yeah, so why do you think uncertainty feels so uncomfortable for most people in product roles?
Product people generally, data-driven, they are slightly control freaks. They like to be able to control the world in which they live in. And often when there are challenges outside of our control, it can become quite kind of frightening to a lot of people. And especially where you have a planned out product roadmap or you've got steps and things that you've been thinking about for quite a while that you want to get to, if that's suddenly thrown out of the way, then your natural reaction is to kind of get a little bit worried about it. And so I think that affects a lot of people. So I think that being more mindful of, it's not something you've lost. It's not something that you've, that has been wasted, but how do we approach those changes, the challenges, and how do we move forward with them?
Yeah, that can be pretty hard because you say it's not what you've lost, but yet a lot of times when uncertainty and change comes, it feels like you've lost something. So what's the biggest misconception, in your opinion, about dealing with change in tech?
That it inherently is a bad thing. I mean, it's not. So change is a vital part of any business, especially in tech. We need to embrace innovation. Innovation is change. So I think we just kind of need to reframe things quite often and to kind of say, well, is this positive change? Can we make it positive change? Can we embrace new technology that's coming in, new ways of doing things? Can we change faster than others, move faster than our competitors? These are all good types of change, really. So, taking that broad view again, looking across the whole ecosystem that we're working in, how do we adapt faster than maybe our competitors or other people who are likely suffering the same kinds of situations?
Yeah, so that brings up an interesting point. And, there are things like healthy adaptability or good change, and then there is bad change as well, like a chaotic pivot.
Yeah.
What are some of your thoughts on the difference between those two?
So I've seen through a broad career and working in lots of different environments, big change events that can come around through IPOs, sale of a company, management restructuring, layoffs, all of those sorts of things. And they will both, usually have good and bad aspects of change associated with them that affect different people in the organization in different ways. So there's no kind of broad brush approach to whether change is inherently a good thing or not. It's more, okay, let's break it down, figure out what's within our span of control, what are the things that we do have control over, and how can we affect that in the best way possible. So certainly in mergers and acquisitions, where you'll have a lot of overlap between teams, maybe products that exist within the organization, people will want to cling on to the old way of doing things, but actually we need to accept that the change has happened, the change is inevitable, and we need to figure out what is the best, most effective way of approaching that change, and to make sure that that we go forward in the most positive way possible.
So is it that taking the time to sit back and process and understand the change before communicating that? Because management definitely usually knows that before they have to make that communication. Is that part of what helps you project that confidence in the face of that ambiguity when you are the leader in that role?
Yeah, so obviously the way that you handle change depends upon your role in the organization. So people who are maybe lower down in the organization, more junior, have less direct agency often over the change that is happening to them. They have to accept a lot more that is inevitable, but they still can have control and impact on things that fall into their realm. As a senior leader approaching change, it's important to make sure that you have the facts, rely upon the facts, make sure those are right, make sure that you understand them, that you have an initial plan, and then make sure that where you're communicating to others, that you're communicating the facts and the truth and transparently making sure that other people are aware of the same thing as well. Going into communicating change too early, without all those facts present, can actually lead to a lot more problems, a lot more fear, and a lot more uncertainty.
Yeah, but sometimes that news slips out. So what happens when rumors start, the news has slipped down? How do you handle that?
Yeah, inevitably that does happen. But again, it's the more transparent that you can be, the more trust that you have with your team, the easier it is to repair that damage. If people are hearing things where you've been holding back information, not being transparent, or been saying things that are untrue, then it becomes much, much harder. So transparency always, authenticity always. Make sure that you're where you do have clear information, that you're telling people about that. And if stuff has slipped out ahead of schedule, which is inevitable, then you just need to follow up on that and say, well, yes, no, that's true, or that's not true, and make sure that you're clear on the reasoning why, for whatever reason, you haven't been able to communicate that ahead of time, and make sure that you're maintaining that bond of trust with the employees.
Yeah, that's a really good point of actually communicating why you didn't plan on providing whatever information it is that leaked ahead of time, because a lot of times there's a great reason that information didn't come out ahead of time, and most people are going to at least understand and be sympathetic to that reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when dealing with restructurings, making sure that the chain of command of HR and everything is done in the right way, you have to make sure that communication of certain variety gets out in the right order. So these are pretty basic HR precepts, but things that we just really need to be very clear of. And again, it comes back to authenticity and being true and letting people know when you can the truth, as opposed to kind of holding anything back that you don't need to.
Well, and it is interesting because you talk about it from the perspective of HR, and also anytime there's an HR change that affects personnel at a company, that is, it doesn't matter if it's a positive change or if it's something like a layoff, this is going to have implications. It's going to have a big impact. But in product, we have customers at the end of our products. So you may not think about it as much the same, but it's very similar, because you've got a story where you've got a change you're going to make. It is going to impact people, but it's going to impact customers. So it's a little different.
Yeah.
You're not managing them as personnel in your company, but there are real people at the other end of it. So there's a lot of applicability and overlap between how you handle like a personnel change announcement versus a product announcement.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. We talked about unwanted change earlier on, and that certainly can impact customers as well. There may be very good business reasons why we're having to make changes that maybe aren't seen so kindly by the customers. I know in the past where we've had to, say, for example, make licensing changes to products. Those are things that the existing customers would probably be reluctant to accept, resistant to. Whereas from the business point of view, they're obviously things that we need to do to continue making money and to make sure that it's a viable business. So those sorts of incidents, you again need to really clearly consider what order are you communicating? How are you communicating? And again, being transparent and open and honest wherever possible as to the reasons behind the changes that you're making and what it means to customers. And again, where companies in the past have held things back or been disingenuous, they get called out on that very quickly and very early and very easily. So, in product, being the voice of the customer, you really have to be that advocate as well and make sure that when you're, in a product leadership role, that you're considering them in the business changes and how they're likely to be impacted by the changes that you're making.
Yeah, I do bring up an interesting one with licensing changes because has a huge implication for your customer base. But you can also end up in a scenario where the customers you have today, you've captured a niche market. And the market that you need to go after to really grow is vastly different than the niche market. So now you might have to make changes that don't make your current customers happy to go after that larger market so that you can actually grow and continue. What would be your advice in handling that?
Yeah, it's certainly much more of it's often more of a problem in startups and scale-up businesses where you're trying to find that product market fit. I mean, obviously, you have the same sorts of things in larger organizations, but the patterns tend to be a little bit more set in the customers that you already have on board. So in startups and scale-ups, really having to be mindful of, one eye on keeping your existing customers, the people, the kernel of your business, happy, and at the same time trying to access those other markets without really frustrating the existing customers. And that can be a really tricky balancing act. I mean, we've seen that before when we've tried to move into new markets or bring new products to market. And it can lead to some really challenging product decisions in terms of changing licensing models, because what works for the consumer customers might be entirely different from what works for large organizations or enterprises. And often the technical challenges that go with that are significant as well. In those sorts of instances, it's really important to keep an eye on your ICP and make sure that you are aware of what your ICP is and where it's changing. Often through the life cycle of a company, again, tends to be on the smaller side. Your ICP will change as you work out what is the right market, what is the right product market fit. So you get to a point where sometimes you have to admit that maybe your ICP has changed and you are deprioritizing the old ICP and moving towards a new one. But that needs to be done kind of authoritatively, really making sure that you're doing that consciously and making that gear shift rather than doing it slowly or without much thought, which can lead to disenfranchisement of the existing customers.
But yeah, you end up in a world where you're not communicating, you're not being transparent. All the things you just told us you need to be able to do, if you're just kind of sleepwalking into this new ICP, you're probably not being clear about it.
Right. Well, exactly.
And that's going to just make people upset.
Yeah. And then one other thing there, and is a classic problem that some companies fall into, is wanting to have their cake and eating it and believing that they can have multiple ICPs. And that can be really, really challenging and is often not the right way of doing things. So kind of really being true to yourself as a customer and as a product group. What is your ICP? Constantly keeping an eye on that, making sure that what was valid yesterday is still valid today.
So do you think that having multiple ICPs is something that's pretty much related to the scale and the size of your business? Like if you're small, you really do need to have one ICP, but as you scale up, could you have multiple ICPs, or are you in a position where that may be in conflict just in general?
No, I mean, it is, I think, certainly possible. And obviously every organization's different, every customer set's different, every technology stack and product stack is different. So I don't think it's necessarily a hard and fast rule. It's more making sure that your organization is set up correctly and your products are set up correctly to support the ICPs that you're going after, rather than just assuming that it's going to work for, wildly different profiles.
But the amount of work to add an ICP is pretty big too.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But if I have two ICPs that are so similar that the work is minimal, it's usually a big lift.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great diagram that we've used to discuss ICPs in the past, which is the pins of a bowling alley, and they're kind of spread out in a V shape, and you can kind of move from one to another, or you can have overlaps between different customer profile groups. So it is possible to expand out, especially as you grow your product organization, and certainly for larger organizations to have different areas. But you just do need to make sure that wherever possible, the core of your business, the core of your product are really supporting the areas that you're most interested in.
Yeah, and in terms of ideal customer profile, which is what ICP means for those of you who may not know, that ideal customer profile is very much a human profile. It's, we have a human side to product management, and it's very much about this type of person has these characteristics, wants these types of things. So kind of speak to the human side of ICP.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth understanding the different components that go into that profile, and whether you're targeting the purchasing profile or the end user profile, the business profile, all of those different components. So there are lots of overlapping things to consider, especially when you're building out your product and you're building out your marketing and sales strategies that go with that. But it's making sure, as product people, making sure that the people who are going to be using your product are going to be delighted by it, are going to enjoy it, are going to find it useful, and that's going to keep people coming back and wanting to use your product. We often find large organizations where the purchasing departments are very disparate from the people actually using it. So you'll find enterprise customers who the actual users dislike using the product, but they are so far away from the purchasing entity that they don't have much say over what tools are purchased, or at least it takes quite a long time for that feedback to get back through. And that's not good for anyone, because ultimately that leads to switching vendors at short notice, or when the contracts come up for renewal, and the product people don't have a lot of ability to change and correct for the errors in the product. So really making sure that we understand the full breadth of how the products are being used, the people who are being impacted by the changes that we're making in the product.
So that is an interesting thing, because, we started our conversation talking about managing uncertainty. And now you're in a scenario, and this is a very classic scenario in B2B sales and B2B product, where the people using the product are not the people making the choices about it. I mean, like, the purchasing person may like your product because the pricing structure is something they understand and they find it easy to buy and do business with you. Yet the people actually using it, they just absolutely don't like that. They don't like the product. They don't mind about the pricing structure because they don't care about pricing. But when it comes down to the actual technical product, they have a beef with it, and it's not getting communicated back up. It's not doing what they need to do. This puts you in a scenario where you have uncertainty at the customer, and you have uncertainty as a product manager in terms of not necessarily knowing that, because that feedback's not flowing back. So in terms of managing that, how should a product manager or product leader try and manage that situation? And what are some of the things that could go wrong trying to get that data and manage that situation?
As the voice of the customer, product needs to make sure that they've got really good communication channels with the customer. And by the customer there, we really mean the people actually using the product. So as product managers, we need to make sure that we're having those regular check-ins, that we're understanding how the product's being used, where the frustrations are, where the things are broken, what are the highest profile and most important things to be fixed, because those may not necessarily be the things that we're hearing about, but actually the underlying problems have bigger impact that are ultimately going to lead to purchasing decisions and those sorts of things. But communication is the key through and through, and making sure, I think that is often something that gets skipped by product a lot of the time, and not having those regular check-ins because they're concentrated on other areas, making sure that new features are being created, or that we're creating the new releases, and not necessarily always doing the deep dive and assuming that things are going well unless we hear otherwise. So I think that's it's like eating healthy food and going to the gym. We've got to kind of force ourselves to do it sometimes to make sure that we're getting the benefit from it.
Yeah, because there are a lot of different places that we could check in as product managers. I mean, my goodness, you can talk to your salespeople who have a direct line to the customer. You can talk to your customer support people who also likely have a direct line to the customer. But then, you've got your marketing team who may have some connections there as well. And that's just that's just 3 teams within the company. There may be other teams. You have to check in with
Yeah.
engineering, make sure things are going well there. There's so many different people you have to actually keep in touch with as part of this job to make sure that you're having those check-ins.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of different data channels. You mentioned the tech side of things there as well. The operations teams, if they're having to actually deploy the product on their local services, making sure that it's not an absolute pain to get your products up and running, as we've certainly seen problems in that area in the past that ultimately can lead to feedback through to purchasing again to say, hey, look, we don't want to set this up. It's a pain to have to support. And similarly, if they have local support teams, they're having to manage and handhold through poor user experience or those sorts of things as well, ultimately are all going to have an impact. So as you were saying, yeah, it's a matter of being abreast of all of those different data channels that are coming in and make sure that we're utilizing and understanding how the products are being used in reality.
That brings clarity and confusion all at the same time because you've got so many channels that you're going to potentially get conflicting messages back. And sometimes you're going to get a message that's loud and clear and it resonates across the board. So, do you have a personal framework or mental model for making decisions when that path isn't clear or when you're getting just so much disparate feedback coming in?
Yeah. Yeah, I always think that it comes back to data. As I said before, product and myself generally are data driven, and making sure that where we have uncertainty, to try and reduce that uncertainty through data. So there's uncertainty in everything, but the benefit comes in reducing that uncertainty as much as possible, and then it becomes clearer. We get more certainty over the things that we know. So that can be in running experiments or gathering data from the customer, making sure that we have good tooling and visibility of metrics and feedback, sentry logs, error reports and bug reports, all of this sort of stuff. This data is gold dust. And that, really is what leads to creating a good product that is used. So yeah, data gathering, data analysis, these are all things that really help to reduce uncertainty in how the products are being used.
Yeah, so very important to have those people that can make sense of what's coming back through data so that you can kind of cut through the noise and actually get to the signal.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be incredibly intense, deep dive data, but it's making sure that we're being structured in the way that we're gathering data, not just kind of, we heard from the customer that they were having some usability problems, making sure we're digging down to the next level and recording that, and then making sure that that's fed back into our decisions that we're making over how to build the product, what to prioritize, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and in that how to build the product, we talked a little bit earlier about multiple ICPs and the danger of going after too many at once. But also, you kind of end up in this scenario where your salespeople are going to go find the people they're going to find, and maybe they're a fit, maybe they're not quite a fit. We could talk all about sales and the dynamic of needing to make sure that the salespeople understand exactly what the product is and who it's for and how adaptable it can be. But, in some scenarios, there may be a deal that's really good that if we just adapt in this one little way, we're netting a really big deal. And sometimes that can actually change like our intentions with the product. But how do you balance that adaptability with maintaining a clear vision for the product, which obviously in the product world, that's gold there is to have that clear vision and to be executing on it and to only change when needed. So speak to that.
Yeah, it's certainly a classic problem that we've seen time and time again. And it's a real challenge when the sales guys have done really hard work, great work. They've gone and won a massive big fish from some major OEM that we've all dreamt of as being a customer. And they come in, and then we go into the discovery phase and find out that actually what they want is not the products that we've got. It's something entirely different. So we really, then as it comes to a management decision and being part of that in terms of determining, should we go after that? What does it mean? And what does it mean not just to the deal cost, but also to the opportunity cost in other areas as well, and to the knock-on impact on our existing customers and our existing product features. Because certainly, with resource-constrained teams, you can't do everything. Even if you get big deals coming in and there's a really big desire to do it, or there can often be, well, okay, we can hire people in to take on that additional capacity. Those are true facts, but also that can lead to complexity, and there's a lot of knock-on that needs to be considered with that as well. So it comes back to keeping focus on your ICP and iteratively through that discovery process as you're looking at that deal and the new features that you need to build, just keep going back to the ICP and keep saying, well, look, if we build this feature, what's the impact on the ICP? Has it shifted? Have we moved away from what we were doing? Or have we just made it bigger? Or have we chosen an entirely different ICP? Or similarly with the core product features that we want to build to satisfy that ICP, does it overlap? Does the Venn diagram of what is needed for this opportunity intersect with the core features that we want to provide in products? And then, making difficult decisions. It can be really, really hard to look at one of these opportunities and say, actually, we're not going to take that on. But you need to look at the long-term benefit, the future of where you want the product to be going, the big picture, and whether it's worthwhile doing that. And if it comes out that actually you shouldn't be doing that right now, there are ways of being able to still get some benefit from that deal by passing it on to others to actually go and implement or partner with people, those sorts of things. But, first and foremost, you really need to it always comes back to what is the product that we want to be building? How is this going to impact it? How do we make sure that we're doing the right thing for our business and for the customers?
Yeah, and you mentioned something really interesting there, and that's that you have the opportunity to partner with another company to potentially get a deal done, because maybe somebody else does something tangential to your space and they do that part better, and yet you could take that on and like compete with that person or that company. But if you just partner with them, not only are they getting better business from it, you're getting better business from it, you're getting to market faster, and there may be other ways that they can help you grow your business and you help them grow their business. So partnerships can actually be very, very beneficial for both involved, even when there's kind of this competitive nature in some areas. You have two companies, there's almost undoubtedly some area where you're going to compete on, but if you can figure out where you're going to partner, that can bear a lot of good fruit.
Yeah.
Partnerships come down to just how well the people at the different companies get along. How aligned are they in what they want to see in the market?
Yeah, when you're partnering, you need to make sure that you're both getting benefit from it and that you understand the benefit and also the cost that comes with it as well. So, we've certainly seen deals in the past where you're partnering with someone and they're expecting you still to provide certain aspects, whether it's support or interaction with the customer, hand-holding, those sorts of things, which you have to be very clear on upfront and make sure that they're documented and part of the contract for the relationship, because otherwise you can still end up spending a lot of time and effort on these sorts of deals for relatively little reward on the back end as well. So it's again all about understanding the deal and figuring out whether it's worth your while still to be involved or whether it should be entirely separate and not involved altogether.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, all of these things that we've talked about today really come back to a need to be able to embrace change, because change is the one true constant. There's always going to be change, and every day we're going to see a new change. And then when you compound it over time, there's a lot of change. You might take change in a small portion today, maybe you get a lot of change a few days from now, but generally on a day-to-day level, change is manageable. But then in the larger scale thing, you go, wow, that was a lot of change we just went through. What's one practical habit or mindset shift that you use to help you embrace that change?
I think it depends upon the scale of the change. As you say, change happens every day. It's incremental. There are little bits and pieces. So with that, it's a matter of keeping stock, keeping perspective of where you are, what is the change that's happening, and being mindful of that. Being careful not to fall into the trap of the analogy of a frog boiling in water very, very slowly over time, making sure that we're understanding the change is happening and where feature creep is happening and all those sorts of things. So keeping stock, taking time to do retro, look back, see where we've come from, see where we are now, make sure that what the customers are asking for or what they've asked for in the past are still relevant today. So all of those sorts of things. So that's the the micro change, if you like. Then when it comes to the macro change, it's much more about breaking it down into manageable bite-sized pieces and really kind of trying to figure out, okay, what is the plan? Putting together a plan here. So where it depends upon the type of change, whether it's organizational or product, or we're going to do something completely different. We need to find a new bucket of customers, or we want to spike a new product really quickly. That sort of change is really becoming understanding how to break it up into actionable points. What comes first? What are the foundations? And how do we move forward from there? So I really like to take the time, wherever possible, to get comfortable with what it we may not know entirely what the finished thing is going to look like, but what are the starting points? What's going to get us in the right direction to start off with, and then slowly and iteratively work forward from there.
Yeah, so if you could change one thing about how tech teams approach change, what would it be?
Often tech teams fear change because it's not invented here. And I've seen that in lots of places, in post-merger integrations and teams that are taking over products from other parts of the business. And that can lead to a lot of wasted energy, a lot of reluctance, and a lot of slow progress. So I really would kind of talk to product teams and to tech teams and to say, look, don't fear change. Don't fear the fact that something new has come along and it's changed the way you've done things before. Let's look at what's the go forward benefit. What are we going to do in the future that is going to be better than where we were yesterday, and how can we make that the case? So once people get over that initial fear of having to deal with an ugly code base or legacy issues or a lack of understanding, then you suddenly, feel a shift in gear and things start moving much more quickly and much more smoothly. So if we can minimize that initial fear phase, we can make progress much, much more quickly.
So can you share a story where that initial fear and uncertainty led to an unexpected success?
Yeah, I think probably one of the most interesting periods of my career was after a startup that I'd been working at was acquired by a much larger company, and they put us together with another startup. And I had to help with the post-merger integration of those two teams. And these were teams that were spread out all over the world. And we had basically a mirror image in these two different companies. And they had two different sets of products, two different sets of gateways, all of those sorts of things. And having to go through the process, not only of bringing the technology together and the platforms and the products and having one set of go forward things that we presented to the customers, but also having to solve the people problem and the social problems that came with that. The two companies had been essentially competitors in the business space and didn't really like each other. And so initially there was a lot of reluctance and kind of fear, actually, of the people in the other teams. And having to get those teams tightly meshed together, working together, communicating, was a great challenge at first, but also something that I found really rewarding once it started working well. And once we had, the daily check-ins and people talking with each other, people doing knowledge transfer sessions and understanding how the other products worked, how the other systems worked, how the other people worked. And yeah, that truly a great experience and something that I enjoyed.
Yeah, that's an awesome story. Thank you for sharing that. So you're a Brit, and keep calm and carry on is the ethos of Britain. And we see this in the British people all the time. But on that idea of keep calm and carry on, how do you turn that from an idea to practical steps that people can put into practice to be able to better handle the pressures of challenging situations?
Without sounding too philosophical, I think it's about understanding the things that you can control and those you can't control, what you can change, what you can't change. And once you realize that and kind of really understood the problem, things start to become a lot easier. Initially, when we have these big change moments, we suddenly find out the company's being sold, or, we're doing a round of layoffs or whatever it is. People are very, very averse to that and very riskful and fearful and unsure of what to do and those sorts of things. So once you've kind of analyzed that, understood what things are real, what things are just rumor or conjecture or may not happen in the future, it becomes much easier to actually go, okay, right, well, there's no point worrying about that stuff because we can't change it. This is what we can impact. This is what we can do today. And often in doing that and focusing on being useful, solving problems, actually working towards a solution, you'll find yourself in a much better position than if you just kind of sit back, or if you're reluctant, or if you're, just paralyzed with fear over the change that's coming. So keeping cool, working things through, again, breaking them down into smaller problems, and work the problem, create the solution.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rick. So, one last question to help our audience get to know you a little bit better. What's one small habit or ritual that keeps you grounded when life gets chaotic?
I like to take walks and, go out in the garden and do things like that. I think that it really does help. It's worth taking the time to do that, because if you're sitting inside in your office and you're just focused on, the computer in front of you, it can become quite overwhelming, and, you get a little bit of almost, you get lost in yourself. Go outside, take a walk. It may feel like completely the wrong thing to do at the time, because you feel like you should be trying to solve the problem and doing all the things I spoke about before in terms of breaking it down and being action biased. But actually, if you go away, it allows you to, and do a physical activity, it allows you to kind of analyze the problem subconsciously and to kind of come back to it feeling refreshed and being able to actually approach it and go, right, okay, now that we've taken in that news, now that we've understood the situation and you've burnt off a little bit of that fear and that energy, then you can often come back to the problem and solve it much, much more effectively. So that's a great tool that I like to use, and I found great success with it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been great having you here.
Been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Cheers.
That's Productly Speaking, brought to you by the letters P and M. If this one resonated, subscribe and pass it along. Real stories travel best by word of mouth. You can find us at www.productlyspeaking.com or on LinkedIn. I'm Carl Abbott. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.